Good evening. I'm Lowery Sims, one of the curators here at the Museum of Arts and Design. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion about the situation of contemporary artists in the Islamic world. But as I read the artists' bios, we sort of realize that most of them, are from the United States, so this whole idea, we'll sort of unpack what it is being in the Islamic world. It's been organized in conjunction with the exhibition Doris Duke's Shangri-La, which is on the fifth floor of the museum. I don't even know. Doris Duke's Shangri-La, Architecture, Landscape, and Islamic Art, and that's on view here at the museum through February 17th, 2013. MAD is pleased to be the inaugural venue for this exhibition, which is the first one of its kind of Doris Duke's Hawaiian estate and collections to be presented throughout the continental United States. It was organized by the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art and has been curated by Donald Albrecht and Thomas Mellons, who are here with us. Please stand up and we can acknowledge you. Thank you. At a time when there is misunderstanding and distrust between the United States and many Muslim cultures, Duke's foundation with Islamic art, as well as her extensive travels in Muslim countries and her work with a broad array of individuals, including scholars, dealers, and artisans, is a refreshing and transformative story. The creation of Shangri-La and its carefully orchestrated surrounding landscape and interior design is documented in the exhibition through photographs, drawings, films, correspondence, and ephemera. Some 60 objects, ceramics, textiles, paintings, tiles, full-scale architectural elements are juxtaposed with historical photographs, dramatically demonstrating the symbiotic relationship between the house and its collections. And they have contemporary photographs of the site that were done by Tim Street Porter, which are absolutely exquisite. Now, an important part of Duke's legacy is the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, which is based at Shangri-La. The mission of the foundation is to promote the study and understanding of Islamic art and culture. As part of that mission, the foundation also hosts artist residencies. And this gave us the idea that we could invite artists, some of whom are residents, as of 2011, to create or present work within the context of the Shangri-La exhibition that reflected their experience at the site. It also gave us here at MAD the idea to explore with a group of contemporary artists the challenges they face being associated with regions in the world known variously as Manasa, as they call it in Dubai, the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, or, as they describe it at the Metropolitan Museum, the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia. I'm not sure what later South Asia means, but I think that's interesting. And this is how the Islamic wing is described at the museum. So we are joined tonight by Afruz, Amighi, and Mohammed, Zakariya, who were residents at Shangri-La, and two other artists, Sandow Burke and Assad Faulwell, who are known for their explorations of cultural production and contemporary issues. In the order they speak, I'm pleased to introduce our discussants. Mohammed Zakariya is a calligrapher, turner, metal worker who brings classical standards to a modern sensibility to produce works on paper, fantasies in wood, and instruments from the history of science. Zakariya began his studies of Islam and Arabic cultures in the 1960s and earned 2 licenses in Islamic calligraphy from Istanbul's Research Center for Islamic Art, History, and Culture, and he was the first Westerner to do so. He has exhibited and lectured extensively in this country and abroad, and he concentrates primarily on classical Arabic and Ottoman Turkish calligraphy. In addition, to his residence at the Doris Duke Foundation, he has had solo exhibitions at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar, the Institute for Works on Paper in San Francisco, the Bellevue Arts Center in Washington State, and the Asia Society in New York. He's also participated in group exhibitions in Saudi Arabia, Dubai, and Kuwait. Zakariya is considered the preeminent ambassador of the art of Islamic calligraphy in America. Los Angeles artist Sandow Burke is a graduate of the Otis Parsons Art Institute. Often developed as expansive multimedia projects, his work deals with contemporary life, emphasizing social issues such as inner-city violence, graffiti, political issues, travel, war, prisons, as well as surfing and skateboarding. He was a recipient of an NEA International Travel Grant to Mexico City in 1995 to study mural painting, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1996, and a Fulbright Fellowship for painting to Rio de Janeiro in 1997. In 1999, he was awarded a Getty Fellowship for painting, followed by a City of Los Angeles Fellowship in 2001. In 2007, he was artist in residence at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris in 2008. His most recent project involves a restoration of the Quran as relevant to contemporary life in America. Sandow is represented by the Copland Del Rio Gallery in Los Angeles, Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco, and PPOW Gallery in New York. Assad Faulwell is also based in Los Angeles. Born in Caldwell, Idaho, he graduated with an MFA from Claremont Graduate University in 2008. Since then, he is shown in New York, Los Angeles, London, Zurich, and Dubai, and is represented in New York by Kravitz Waby Gallery and in Dubai by Lowery Shabibi Gallery. In 2008, he received a Joan Mitchell Foundation grant, and in 2011 received the Visions from a New California Award. Reviews of his work have appeared in Art Forum, New York Times, LA Weekly, Art Week, Art Dubai Journal, and the Contemporary Practices Journal, among others. Afruz Amighi received her BA in Political Science from Barnett College in 1997 and her MFA from New York University in 2007. In 2006, she was selected for Emerge 7, a program for emerging artists sponsored by the Algeria Center for Contemporary Art in collaboration with Creative Capital. Amighi has shown her work extensively in the United States, London, and the Middle East. She is the recipient of the inaugural Jamil Prize awarded by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 2009. In 2011, Amighi received the Fellowship in Sculpture from the New York Foundation on the Arts. Amighi is represented by Nicole Beauchamp Gallery in New York and by Isabel van der Eyden Gallery in Dubai. Amighi's work is in the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Bristol Museum in the UK, and the Devi Institute in New Delhi. Amighi was born in Tehran and lives and works in New York. So we will start with Mohamed, and we will go through, and then we will all come back up on the stage and have a discussion. Mohamed?
Laur, you can call me Zach if you, it's a lot easier. Okay, I kind of come from a different sort of place than most of you are coming from. I come from a sort of a really strange background that has led me into this thing in a lot of different ways that kind of went in sort of what we would call a classical direction, although I didn't have much of an education in that. And so, first thing of all, I'm going to run through the pieces just so you have a look at what I'm doing, and then we can talk a little bit about them. So let's see, how do I make it go? Start? Yeah. Which one? Yeah, okay. This is the kind of piece that I like. It's called the hediye in Turkish. It's a description of Mohamed, and this is a real simple one, just yellow ink on black paper in the Talit script. It's actually about 4 feet high, and it's devoid of all of the things that we typically think belong in this kind of thing. You know, it's very simple. My directions in this stuff have gone from complex and to simplicity, and then to simplicity that's sort of wrapped up in complexity, but the complexity sort of takes the back seat. This is part of what we do in terms of a piece, you might call it an homage. This is an homage to Assad who was I guess what, 18th century calligrapher who was a very handicapped person. He was paralyzed on the right side of his body, stuff like that. But he laid the foundations for this particular kind of script. And it's a very sinuous kind of script. It's a close friend of mine who, because of his diplomatic collections, will remain anonymous. But he said, this to us is, in our art, this is the nude. It has all of the sinuosity and the muscularity and the shape and the line and tonalities and things like that. One of the things we like to do with these things is to do these pieces that reverberate off of earlier pieces. This is a poem that I did for an exhibition out in California. This is a famous Arabic poem. Let me translate it for you. If women are like I say they are, then they are better than men. It's a famous Arabic poem, probably 10th century, something like that. Then he gets into a little bit of Arabic grammar where he says, the feminine gender, grammatically speaking, of the sun is not a defect, nor is the masculine gender of the moon. So it's just the opposite, Luna and all that. Nor is the masculine gender of the moon something for the moon to brag about. This is one which is based on a poem which is a lament for a dead cat, which again is probably 10th century, something like that. It's very, very moving. This is actually a teeny little part of it. It's over 150 lines, and very moving cat story, if you like cats especially. It says, "O cat," he says, "you left us and didn't come back, and you were amongst us at the status of a child." And that's a fuzzy one. Any way to get that a little bit better focus? Too bad. These things were at one time slides, and to get them from the slide to the PowerPoint sometimes is a thankless. Anyway, this is large. This is a Quranic piece. I don't do that many Quranic pieces, but I do some. And this is one again in the Talik script. It seemed like this was going to be one of the good ones, but because of the thing, let's pass it. This is the end of the show, and this is again a hidye, and this is about 30 inches high. It's of an intensity of gold that when you look at it and you begin, the problem is, in the photo you can't really see because there's textures involved in here from the gold, and there's textures involved with the paint and the ink and the burnishing of the paper, and then there's little things you do with a stylus to make the gold behave in a way that makes it jump out a little bit. And so you're only getting a kind of half of it, but it's one of my favorite pieces. I consider it sort of the best I've done so far. So let's leave it with that. And we had a series of questions which I don't remember what they were, so I think I'll let it pass, and we'll take anything up of interest when we come to the discussion at the end. And therefore somebody else can have a longer discussion. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sandow Burke. I'm an artist from Los Angeles. It's nice that Lowery put my work after Mohammed's because you'll see a lot of the work that I do sort of draws on what he's been doing. I grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles. I started surfing when I was 11 years old, and I still surf all the time. And a lot of the recreational travel that I do is to go places in the world to go surfing. As an artist, I do these projects that sort of start as a small idea and they get bigger and bigger. And several years ago, I did a big project about the war in Iraq that became a series of prints, enormous woodblock prints that I did with my wife, Elise Pignolet, and a team of artists in Maui and Hawaii. But it was a project that took about a year and a half or 2 years while George Bush was president, and it started because I was quite upset about the start of the war in Iraq and the course of the war in Iraq. And so during these 2 years, we were constantly like following the news and really paying attention to the political events and everything, and listening to a lot of the discourse in the United States about, about the perceived cultural differences between the Islamic world and the United States, and were they incompatible forever, and these sort of big projects, these sort of big concepts. Listening to all this discussion going on in the American media about the extreme like foreignness of the Islamic world sort of made me stop and think about how I had been to all these Islamic parts of the world in the course of my surfing travels, and I sat down and thought about it, and I think I found out that I had been to Islamic parts of the world for extended periods on about 10 different visits to countries as various as Indonesia and India and the southern Philippines and Morocco, and all these places where I had spent time and had these fantastic experiences. And none of my personal experiences in the Islamic world were anything like the discussion that was going on in the United States, which led me at some point to, I thought, rather than listen to all these people on the radio tell me what Islam is about, maybe I should just figure it out for myself. And I went down to the local bookstore and picked up a copy of the Quran and started reading it. And that has led me to the project I'm currently working on. It's a project I've been calling American Quran, in which I am recreating an entire Quranic manuscript in English, sort of following some of the traditional formats of the page layouts and things of traditional Quranic manuscripts, but then sort of illuminating the pages with scenes of life in the United States. The idea is to sort of take the text of the Quran and put it into images that sort of an average American person could relate to, in the attempt to make the text seem less foreign and more relevant to our daily lives. For example, this is a page that talks about the flood, the great flood of Noah and Noah's Ark, and I've illuminated it with scenes of the flood of Katrina in New Orleans. This is a passage that talks about this metaphorical story of these 7 men that went into a cave and they fell asleep, and when they came out of the cave, like 100 years had gone by, and they sort of had to re-interact with people. It's sort of one of the main metaphorical stories in the Quran, and so I've used the miners trapped in the cave in West Virginia a couple of years ago as a contemporary metaphor. It's a project I've been working on for about 6 years now. I'm about 80% through. I expect to finish in a year. It's been shown several places around the United States. It's been shown here in New York at PPOW Gallery. When I was halfway finished with it, they took 120 pages of it and showed it at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. It's been shown in LA and San Francisco several times, and Texas and Colorado. So in the course of this, I've taken breaks from this long six-year intense sort of personal study of this project, and done sort of side projects that have come out of my interest in the Quran. In every showing of the project, I've included a mihrab someplace in the gallery, which is a traditional, usually it's a traditional ceramic wall hanging or a niche in the wall that shows you the direction of Mecca for people if you want to pray. In the Islamic world, you can find them in people's homes or in hotel rooms and things. This is a series of drawings that I did in collaboration with Elise, my partner. We've done several, probably 15 works based on the idea of the 99 most perfect names of God, which appear in the Quran. This is a series of 5 really large, like 7-foot tall ink drawings, which depict all the 5 airports which were involved in the attacks of September 11th. And all the departure and arrival gates are labeled with one of the 99 names of God. In this instance, this is Los Angeles Airport, which was one of the destinations of the flights if they had carried on. And this is a close-up of a drawing of Boston Logan Airport, which is one of the airports where the planes took off from. In one of the most recent exhibitions of the project, Elise, who studied ceramics, we collaborated and made a series of video cameras, and they're decorated sort of with traditional Islamic decorations, and then the center lens is labeled with the name of God, as if he's sort of perpetual watching you from above. And then this is one of the mihrabs that we made. It was shown in San Francisco, I believe. Again, as much of the project, sort of the general way I work is I start taking the text of the Quran sort of at face value and then thinking about how does this message relate to me as a human being living in California in the 21st century. And so when we sat down to think about, we wanted to make a mihrab to show the direction and everything for the show, but then we started thinking about, well, what is sort of the niche that American people are familiar with, that they interact with every day? And so we came up with this, and it has verses of the Quran around it that I chose, and they're done in English. And then from the side you can see it's meant to be an ATM machine, sort of the niches that Americans are used to dealing with every day in their lives. So these are the projects that I've been working on. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Assad, and the body of work that I'm going to show, all the pieces are related to each other. And I've been working on it on this series for about 2 years. How I came to it, it was kind of, I watched when I was in grad school, I was working on a different body of work having to do with post-colonialism and kind of the effects and the reactions to it. And I saw the movie The Battle of Algiers for the first time. And, you know, I was definitely kind of moved by the movie, definitely interested in a lot of themes that it was presenting. It related to what my work was about already in terms of the post-colonial struggle and era. And then maybe 2 years later, I actually started making work about some of the figures from the film. But it was 2 years of kind of studying about it, reading whatever I could find on it. And actually what proved to be the most difficult was finding images of the people, and specifically the women who were depicted in the movie. So if you haven't seen it, in the movie, basically the Algerians are trying to liberate Algiers from the French. And they're doing so by planting bombs in the French Quarter, attacking police stations in the French Quarter, things like this. The French shut down the Algerian part of the city and put up barricades and checkpoints so that you can't get in or out without being searched. But they don't search women out of respect for Islamic culture. So the Algerians started recruiting young women, usually kind of college-age, college students, to become the main combatants against the French. So all of the women depicted in these pieces are the actual women, not the actors who were playing them in the movie. And they are all women who carried out either one attack or multiple attacks against the French. in pretty much every case, they were captured alive, and then usually subjected to really brutal torture to get information, and then they were put on trial in Paris. All of them were convicted and sentenced to death, and then all of them were pardoned by Charles de Gaulle at the end of the war and returned to Algeria. So this one is it's 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and this depicts one of the women. She was actually the only one. She was actually French, French parents, born in France, but she fought on the Algerian side in the war. Her parents were sympathetic to the Algerian cause and encouraged her to basically enlist. So she actually carried out multiple attacks because she kind of had the easiest time not being detected because of her background. So the pieces are supposed to kind of mimic like shrines, not necessarily only Islamic in nature, but any kind of religious shrine. So there's a lot of influence from icon painting, from Hindu shrines, Buddhist shrines, Islamic art, anything that just kind of is supposed to depict some kind of divine quality. And the reason for that was that the movement that they were a part of, it was not a religious movement. It was actually a very secular movement that wanted to put in place a secular government in Algeria after liberation. And I think most of the interviews with the women and the writing would indicate that they thought that they were staking their claim for kind of women in the new Algeria and kind of equality in the independent state. And what ended up happening was that, as women's rights kind of eroded over the years, most of them ended up actually leaving the country, and the majority of them ended up living in France. So ironically, they ended up kind of going and living in the home of their former kind of colonial ruler. Okay, so this one's a little bigger. It's 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide. And this one depicts 2 women. So the women on either side, the woman on either side, that's the same woman, mirror image of herself. This is the image that the photograph was taken of her after she was tortured and she had signed her confession letter. The French press was brought in to take pictures of her. The image in the background is the image of the woman that she gave up the location of. So she gave up like what safe house she was hiding in, and then she was captured as a result of that information. This is an image of that same woman actually signing the confession letter, but I tipped her on her side, so it looks like she's reaching up. In the photograph, she actually was holding a pen and paper in her hand and was signing the confession. But it's, same theme, basically, of kind of this shrine. And kind of, I think they have a lot of like landscape kind of qualities to them also. Here's another one. She's actually one of the few that ended up staying in Algeria. She actually served in the parliament for a very long time and was kind of the main advocate for women's rights in the country after the war. Okay, and then this image, this is from after she was pardoned and released. She came back to Algeria, and then there was basically like a couple of the women were honored by the Arab League, and this image was taken from a press photograph from that event. So it's basically, it was her, and then behind her it was, it's a really interesting picture because she's the only woman in the photograph, and there's about 100, maybe 150 men standing behind her, and she's kind of standing like out in front of them. so she ended up going back to Algeria and then ended up moving to France actually, and ended up marrying the attorney who represented her in her trial in Paris. And then this one was a little bit different. So the larger figure actually she was not a combatant, but she was the aunt of the smaller figure that's down at the bottom with just her face showing. And she was a recruiter, so she recruited a lot of these young women to come and join. That's actually, that's an image of her niece who ended up joining and carrying out, I think, one attack. Okay, and then this was a piece I did for my last show in New York, which was quite a bit larger than the others. It's 5 feet tall and 14 feet long. So rather than the other pieces, which were more kind of iconic, I was trying to do something where I could kind of tell more of a story in one piece. So have more of kind of a linear narrative from kind of beginning to end in one image. And then this piece is kind of along those same lines. This is the last big thing that I did. And this one's 5 feet tall and 12 feet long. And same idea in that it depicts kind of the narrative of capture, the kind of confession, another woman being discovered, and then her discovery leading to the death of another woman, and then kind of a separation point, and then at the end is the image of her at the kind of after the war at the award ceremony at the Arab League. But the pile of heads that's the only woman who was actually killed in battle. So after her location was discovered, the French military came to that apartment building, and they basically told her, like, we know you're in there and get out. She was hiding inside of a room that had been constructed inside of a wall, so she was living inside the wall. She refused to come out. She was with a couple. She was with a man and a boy inside the wall. They all refused to come out, and so the building was blown up, and they were all three crushed inside the wall. And then I just have a few detail images just to show a little bit of kind of close-ups of that piece. And the books that kind of appear in some of the images, they are supposed to reference not just religious texts, but also political texts, just the way that kind of ideology drives people to do certain things, take maybe kind of actions that are that they would not otherwise take. And that sometimes those ideologies, while they can in the short term liberate you, can in the long term kind of be your undoing. And it's a little blurry, but this one you can see there's pins stuck into the canvas. So that where her eye is, that's done with pins that have had small designs painted on the pin heads. And I think that's the last one. No, one more, okay. Okay, that's it.
Hi, I'm Afruz, and I'm gonna show you some old work and then bring you to the present, which is a real radical departure for me. This first piece that I show is one of the older pieces of my work. It is made in 2008, and it's called 1001 Pages. It's kind of hard to see the scale. You can sort of see a little bit. There's a doorway kind of on your left or your right. So this is a fairly large piece, and the story of this piece is that, well, first of all, let me just break it down a little bit. This is a hand-cut piece of plastic. This over here. This over here is the shadow that is cast from this illuminated plastic into the wall behind it. Okay? So the story of this piece is that I was just come out of graduate school, and I was having a very hard time. I was very depressed, and I was not able to make work. And I looked to my professor and my mentor, Sue DeBeer, and she said to me, Afruz, I have a special project for you. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you have to make something really, really good, and you got to do it in 3 months. And so I was like, oh my God, all I've been doing is going to the studio and, reading magazines and, staring out the window, and what am I going to do? But all of a sudden, I had this deadline, and so I had to do something. And so I made this piece, which is, the way I made it was I used something, it's like a hot pen, and I burned through the plastic, and so like all the negative images, or all the material kind of falls out and creates this kind of lace-like effect. And so when the 3 months was over and I finished this project, and I said to her, okay, so is there a show, or is there, something? And she's like, no, I just wanted you to just make something and just get out of your rut. And I was, it was like a really nice trick that she played on me, because it got me, into making things once again. And which way am I pointing this? Anywhere? There we go. Okay, so now this image is just the plastic part of the piece. And just a note about the material, it's actually called woven polyethylene, and it's a material that the United Nations uses to construct refugee tents in refugee camps for people. And so not only did it lend itself very well to, me burning the images into it, but it also seemed to be kind of have this history to it that I found, very sort of interesting and just very sort of layered. And all of the imagery you see here was an attempt for me to compile all that I had been reading during my artistic rut into one kind of image. And so there's lots of fables and stories inside the piece. So down in the bottom, you see this kind of like, it's like a broken spider web in here, and there's a spider up here. And it's coming from a fable in the Quran about when Mohamed is, he's having some enemies and they're chasing him, and so in order to seek cover, he basically goes and hides in this cave. And the spider, who is very sympathetic to his cause, goes and weaves this web around the entrance of the cave. So when the enemies come, they see, oh, no one could have possibly passed into this cave because there's this, spider web in its place. And so I basically put together all these sorts of stories into this piece to try to talk a little bit about the history of contemporary Iran, which I'm not going to get into. But I think I just want to point out here that just like Christianity has been very secularized in the United States, and so people who may be Jewish or Muslim or another religion may refer to Christmas or to Easter or to things associated with Christianity. It's in a very secularized way, to the point where we don't even realize we're referring to oftentimes Christian symbolism. A lot of these references to the Quran and to Islamic mythology are coming just from my childhood of having been raised to an Iranian family, but a Jewish mother and a Zoroastrian father. Nonetheless, Islamic mythology is sort of secularized into Iranian society and therefore is a reference point for people even in the minority religions. This is a piece that actually I just finished it about 2 months ago. It's made out of jewelry chain and aluminum radiator covers. Again, I really am interested in materials that have some other use for them, even if it's as mundane as a radiator cover. Basically, the strips that you see are the cutout pieces of radiators, and the chain as well. It's not real silver. It's a base metal kind of chain. This is a piece that's called Tofan, which means storm, and it's about 17 feet high and 12 inches in diameter. And this is part of a series of pieces that I made to really with thinking about a lot of things. Well, mainly, I really love chandeliers, and I really love jewelry. These very decadent, luxurious things we associate with wealth. And I also am, cognizant of the fact that much of the wealth generated in the United States comes from the arms economy, which is a permanent arms economy. And so I thought that I would make a series of idols or things that could be hung sort of as like, stand-in for chandelier or something that would mimic the shape of missiles or rockets or bullets or things that are produced, on a regular basis in this country. And I sort of had this fantasy that this would hang over, the large dinner table of a very wealthy patron, and so they could sort of give homage to the real source of their actual wealth, if that makes sense. This is just a close-up shot. It's a lot of the labor involved in this work is very much similar to what jewelers do. This is a triptych of the same kind of work I initially showed you in the exhibit in Dubai. Essentially, I was really interested at the time in telling sort of narratives about the Iran-Iraq War, things that I was personally absent from myself, and that I only learned about through books and then through interviewing people when I visited Tehran. And I think I felt really comfortable. It wasn't conscious, like, oh, I made these because, blah, blah, blah. It was like I found that using shadows as a medium, because they're so dematerialized, they're sort of unstable, they kind of move. There's always a little bit of like an air source that blows the tapestry. And so I felt somehow kind of more comfortable telling these stories in a dematerialized form because it seemed less rigid, it seemed less like tacked down and less like certain somehow. And this is just a close-up where you can see the shadow. This is a recent, maybe a year ago, installation called Self-Portrait in Chain. And in this piece, you can see in the central sculpture, you can sort of discern that there's 3 sculptures inside of it. And partially this was a self-portrait, and it's kind of weird to talk about that. It just sort of, it was just, that's what it felt like. But it was also installed in Santa Barbara, which is home to Raytheon. And So I was thinking about that when I made this piece, and that definitely informed some of the shapes of the sculpture. This is a close-up where you can kind of see the structures that I built inside the main structure. Ah, okay. And this is work that's brand new. It's like really brand new, and I haven't really thought of how to talk about it, but essentially when I was making it, it's made from concrete, steel, and epoxy, and it's a series of 8 crowns. I was always been really fascinated with jewelry design, and also I was looking a lot of medieval torture devices, and they kind of came together. And I was also thinking about the human skeleton and greed, and what it would be like if greed just grew out of our skull. What would it look like? So here's another shot. It's kind of like the embryo for what I hope to, well, as an embryo, it's not fully realized. It's kind of just the beginning of what the turn I'm trying to make. So, thank you.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things, as some of you, I knew your work better than others, and sort of doing the research. And in a way, I came to sort of think that this was a kind of a bogus panel to a certain extent, trying to sort of really pigeonhole you all into a kind of Islamic world, when it's, a much more richer story that we want to tell. So I guess we can go to the questions that Zach sort of really talked about. Sort of really deconstructing these designations of Islamic and Muslim. And I'm struck by, the stories of how you tended to sort of come to your work and to the themes. Some of them are, topical, what's going on. Some of them extraordinarily personal. Some of them may have even more spiritual kinds of sort of impetus. So, let me start with you, Zach. Here you are, Ventura, California. Okay. And, I don't know how much of your journey you want to talk about, but, calligraphy is, very specific, specialized, but with the Arabic script, it's very rich, at the same time. So, what attracted you to it?
Actually, I wanted some of it,
Mm-hmm.
and I couldn't afford it, and I couldn't get any, and I thought, maybe I could make my own, and I was like 19 at the time, and I ended up doing the calligraphy for our first mosque in LA, the very first mosque in Los Angeles that was out in a place called City Terrace. It was way out in East LA, and I did that when I was 19, and then, of course, this is rubbish, and ended up getting thrown in the bin after a while, but I kind of worked up from that, but I had to, you got to make a living in the art world, and there wasn't anything there, and so I did a lot of other stuff, mechanical type things, as you mentioned, woodwork. When I first came to DC in '72, I made modern furniture, handmade modern furniture and stuff like that, Then I made a whole bunch of things like contraptions and kaleidoscopes and astrolabes and sundials, stuff like that. So, you do a lot of stuff, you get a lot of skills, but precision was always kind of a deal because I used to work in the factories, the aerospace factories, and so I learned precision machining, and so I always liked the idea of precision. And so calligraphy is precision writing, and we're dealing, visually with tolerances of probably a tenth of a thousandth in some areas. Visually it's kind of like human comparator, stuff like that. So that was something. But the thing is, there's also language, and language is to me one of the most fascinating things. And I happen to luck out. I'm like half deaf, but I can still work. and I learned classic Arabic pretty much, and then in the last 20 years I've been working a lot on Ottoman Turkish, and so to use these languages to see how these texts that we use work is marvelous, because you know, people say them and they mumble them and they use them as jingles and they don't always think how you're using it, but when you really get into them and analyze the texts and read about what smart people have said about them in the past, then they come to life in a different kind of way. And that's what I think Sandow's thing just absolutely blows me away when I started hearing what he's doing. Mm-hmm. You know, we all used to think, oh my God, he's going to get into a lot of trouble doing that, you know. It's, oh, you better duck, you know. And it doesn't happen, thank God. So, or did it?
No.
No. But in any case, you know, it's an expanding universe, you know, really. I have to deal with many different, you know, cultures, you know, myself, but I'm basically, you know, part of this American continuum, you know. Islam plays at this stage of the game a very small part, but it's happening, and it's happening in a way that's rather different from where it's happening in other places.
I had a technical question for you when I was looking at your work. Do you do the papers, the borders?
I make them from scratch totally. I make my
God.
paint. Recently, I switched over to using Iranian ink. That's the only thing that's kind of pre-made. It's difficult stuff to use, but all of us in the business have switched over to it now. But there's so many different kinds. But no, I grind my paint. You got a company down there on 28th Street called Kramer, which develops some really good pigments and adhesives, and you know, I produce my own gold 24, 11, 18 karat gold paints and stuff like that. Burnishing, it's a lot of muscle work, and it's got to be just right, or else it'll all fall apart. You know, I mean, when you do a thing like that, it's got to be seamless. As a matter of fact, mine are on the front, but there's also something on the back and on the edge, so they're three-dimensional.
Right.
And that makes it into a kind of a different kind of an object. It makes it more of an object. Whether it's an art object or whether it's an Islamic art object, which I kind of doubt, is a different story. Because when we use the term Islamic art, it's a really tricky problem, because people call it that in some languages and not in others. And so what do we call it? No one can get an idea yet, you know. Everybody's got to wing it at this stage.
Well, I think when we were preparing materials about Shangri-La, we got hung up on the use of Islamic and Muslim, you know,
Yeah.
and does that take into account Zoroaster? You know, I mean, you know, so it's. I think that, you know, the words are so loaded that, you know, inevitably you get sort of caught up in, you know, trying to sort of be correct, you know, and sort of use the, you know, in a kind of appropriate way. But I think interesting what you bring up is that there is a kind of pervasive idea that Islamic culture is such that there are so many restrictions that you could get in trouble, you know, like if you sort of broke away and things like that. So, but I think that a lot of contemporary artists, you know, like are sort of stretching and straining. So I'm just wondering, you know, if you all have had, you know, different experiences, you know, with presenting the kind of work that you do that, you know, might be either positive or negative, or how it expands out, you know, sort of the idea of what we think about, you know, say manuscript painting and things like that. Sandow, could you talk to that a little bit?
I didn't really see the question. I have.
Just talk about, you know, when you started doing this stuff, was there a kind of reaction to what you were doing?
You know, I actually did quite a bit of a big body of work before I ever exhibited it, and then I had like a big show of it all at once. So no, there wasn't any real negative reaction. There was a lot of people saying there was going to be one, like saying like, you know, these people are going to be really angry, but those people were always sort of like imaginary people that were not the people asking the question. In the many times I've exhibited my projects, really there's been like a handful of like sort of angry anonymous emails sent to the galleries, and then often they've turned out to be from right-wing Christian groups that say, I Americans shouldn't be reading the Quran and they shouldn't be exposed to it and they shouldn't be learning about it and things like that.
Well, I think at Afruz, we sort of talked about, the limitations, like saying from your experience of Islamic and Muslim, in that sense.
Whenever I'm brought into this dialogue, I always have to decide whether I'm going to be gracious or blunt. And
Please be blunt.
I'll try maybe to navigate between the two. But I think one just point about this discussion, which is perhaps a telling point, is that this discussion which we are embarking on right now, there's a profound disconnect between this and the kind of discussions I have with my colleagues, my peers, fellow artists. I never talk about Islamic mythology, symbolism, Iranian history. It just never, whether the art is Islamic, whether it's not, it's something that only gets discussed in institutional situations. And I think that's, a sign of something, right? The second point I will say is that although I'm from two minority religions, I am from an Islamic country. I mean, it's a 99.9% Muslim country, and I think that's an accurate description of most of the architecture and the art that, is being or has been produced. I think my, picking bone or whatever is that I have been in New York for the past 30 years, and I'm an Iranian American. I'm making contemporary work in New York, and so, and as I mentioned before, my discussions with other artists, are about other subject matter, and oftentimes when I think non-European Americans make work that maybe talks about the Middle East or war or something, it's called identity politics. But when the opposite, when Europeans make that, it's called art, right? But when you do it from the region, if you have some tie to the region, it's called identity politics. And there's this big, thing that, identity politics is so passé, and you can't really talk about that. But what about you may remember some years ago when trailer parks, images of trailer parks were appearing everywhere in, contemporary art, or antlers or whatever. Did people say, that's poor white identity art? No, it's just art. So, I mean, you can wrap me up.
Okay.
It's just a sort of a false category in my case. I'm not working from Tehran.
How do you get past that? In the institutions, because very much your work is going to be seen in galleries, institutions. It's going to be looked at by critics who have preconceived ideas about this. Do you work with it? Do you
both? I mean, I think to some degree you work with it until it reaches a point where you feel like you're too much of a hypocrite. You know what I mean? When you are having no opportunities, you take certain opportunities that might not be placing you in or categorizing you in a way that you would like, and then hopefully at some point you then are able to be more strategic about it, and that it doesn't eat your soul.
Right. Now, Assad, when I look at your work, I see a lot of Our Lady of Guadalupe, in those images. I mean, I wouldn't say that the decorative schemes are what I would associate with, Algeria or
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and I think I've consciously tried to not make it too referential to one specific thing. So I think for that reason, that might be something that it references, and I definitely I think they reference a lot of, Catholic Christian icons, which I think, relates definitely. But I think like there's a lot of, truth to what you're saying. It's kind of a line that you walk to a certain degree. Like we both show with galleries in Dubai. I'm pretty sure no gallery in Dubai would be interested in my work if I wasn't half Iranian. So in some sense, there's an opening there because of it. But then like not wanting to just get totally like swallowed up by that, kind of idea, which really isn't related to any truth. Like my mom's family is a non-religious Muslim family. My dad's family is non-religious Catholic, and I've never been to a mosque or a church. So it has, any relation that Islam has to me is through the cultural aspect of it, in the sense that it's embedded into aspects of Iranian culture that I was raised around. But I think, that the term of Islamic art is a very tricky one, and I think it's one I've tried my best to not like fall into.
I'm just sort of trying to think, if this was 1970 and we were in the midst of formalism and color field painting, would you all be doing work of this sort? I think there is a way that you've also consciously cultivated, what you've grown up with, what you're familiar with, in your work. I think about that because, my own experience with identity politics was, through the African American lens. And I remember at that point there were a lot of African American artists who did abstract work. They went to Yale, they did, and they used to talk about the fact that they would send their slides, remember slides, to, a gallery, and the gallery would respond favorably, and then they'd show up for their appointment, and then all of a sudden they would be told, well, we don't show black art. And I was sitting there going, at what point did that art become black? So this whole kind of, way that the art world, still sort of links, a person's heritage, biology, racial identity, and with their subject matter is always, like a kind of very interesting one for me. And what the four of you do, it seems to me, is sort of really, blow it out of the window, out of the water, in a very kind of interesting way. So I'm wondering if you all, would the calligraphy become more, sort of a minimalist, sort of, abstraction, the way that, American and French artists were taking Zen, calligraphy,
I think it's a real trick, because myself, I've always moved outside the art world. I've been so peripheral to it. As some people have tried to, let's say, promote it, and they just said this dog isn't going to race, It's so I always worked on the outside of it, and I've done all right with it. But the actual interference with the actual art world has been pretty well zip. So that's pretty much what that works like. Now I'm so old, it doesn't matter anyway. But I have an agent, we do all these things, but we always end up having to invent new ways of showing it in new places and stuff like that.
Because I wonder if we would look at, say, your chandelier missile pieces in a different way if, people weren't aware of where you were from, or who you were and what your personal, predilections were about.
Probably.
The leading question.
Yeah, no, I think it's, look, I think, for me, when I talk on this, it can easily become a griping session, and I think just to put things in perspective, it's like the United States in particular is extremely progressive in terms of assimilating immigrants, like more than many, social democratic countries in Europe. And so I think that it's just sort of a stage that different groups go through. You know, it's like, you know, I'm sure Latino artists, you know, or Nuyorican artists, Black artists, you know, it's like, you know, you go through this hyphenation process. And then at some point, you're hopefully through discussions and different modes of communicating the discontent at that hyphenation, you know, you become absorbed into just the general category of contemporary art. So I think that's the trajectory that we're looking at.
Right. I think just to sort of turn it into, you know, since we're about making and process here, materials and process here at MAD, I'm interested in that each one of you in a certain way, you know, are sort of very involved, you know, like in very intense materialistic, you know, sort of approach, you know, to your work. Could you talk, each of you talk about a little bit about what that means for you and, you know, how it sort of adds, you know, to say, you know, what you're thinking about in your approach to your subject matter?
I used to work much more loosely, and it's just been something that's kind of happened over time that I've just kind of become more and more obsessive and working with smaller and smaller materials and smaller you know, types of mark making. And it's been something like 5 years ago I never would have imagined that I would work that way. But now I kind of like, I love the obsessiveness of it, and I don't know, for me I enjoy it because like I could be working on something, you know, 10, 15 feet long, and it takes, you know, 6 months to make. It evolves so slowly that I have a lot of time as I go to like try to get things exactly the way I want them, where working with like a faster process, there's maybe more left to chance. So I don't know, it's kind of like a control freak kind of thing in a way. But to the last point too of like you're saying, like Black artists showing up and them saying like, we don't show Black art. I can't tell you the number of times people have contacted me assuming I'm a woman. And it's just like, it's an assumption because the work is about women.
Right.
So there was like an article in Dubai where they said I was a woman all the way through. I've had people email me, and you know, then when I show up and meet them, they're like, you know, I don't know if it makes it better or worse for them, but it's, you know, it's definitely like people. It's again like the same kind of thing, like with be it religion or ethnicity, gender. It's like this assumption. You can't possibly make work about anything if you are not, you know, like fitting tightly into that category. So, yeah, I mean, I think hopefully it is like this thing that will kind of eventually everything just kind of, you know, melts together. But I think right now there definitely is a desire to compartmentalize, for sure.
Now, your sense of materials, you know, we had many questions about your screen upstairs, if it had been laser cut or cut by hand, and everybody wants to know who Jose is. But again, you know, when you sort of reveal that it's done by, you know, hand, and, you know, sort of the burning process, I mean, where you could have taken it, you know, done the design on the computer and sort of, you know, had it laser cut. So what does it mean for you to sort of be so involved, or fusing all those chains together with the covers and things like that?
I really prefer the tedium. I like the tedium of it. I enjoy it. Sometimes I think maybe it's because I think if it were laser cut, I think it might be a little less, have a little less of a warm feeling to it. I've seen things that are laser cut that are, you know, quite beautiful, but the perfection is a little bit off-putting to me. And so that's not the only reason, but that's certainly a factor for me. But I think I enjoy the, you know, it's like the Agnes Martin-esque kind of like, whoa, you know, like I'm, you know, brain, outer space land. And so let's just say I enjoy it to a point. Like now I will never, I'm making one more of these things, these screen things. No mas. Never again. It's like the opposite of, I had a word for it. It's called, and it's escaping me right now. Anyway, it's just it's like churning it out. Like that's how it feels. It's like no creative juices whatsoever. So it's almost over. Thank God.
So Sandow, it was impressive how you created this kind of script, where you have to sort of really get into it. I mean, what was that process? I mean, did it come to you? Did you look at different fonts on the
Oh, the script that I'm using?
Yeah.
It's being I'm not that schooled in Islamic art, but I knew, right offhand that calligraphy is the most important thing. So I really, throughout the whole project, I really try to think of how can I sort of create something new that's American. And then so I thought, well, what sort of calligraphy is an American calligraphy, or who in the United States really cares about calligraphy? And I immediately just thought of graffiti writers, who are people in my neighborhood that spend like every waking moment practicing letters and doing letters and writing them on the garage doors in my neighborhood. And so I thought, this sort of graffiti is sort of an American thing. I mean, now it's a global thing. But and then I went even more to like East LA, early like Cholo graffiti from the 60s, which is like, early graffiti writing, and I use that for my font. Yeah. Yeah. But like you were talking earlier, I mean, one thing that I think about a lot as being a contemporary painter is about I'm always wondering about why I'm a painter in the 21st century. Like, why do I sit alone in a room and make things in this way that takes so many hours in the world of digital things? And maybe I'm overly concerned about that because I live in Los Angeles, where my next door neighbors are all working in movies, and they go off to make music videos and records, and it's like the center of the digital world in LA. And then here I'm at home, like doing these tedious oil paintings or something. And so when I decided to make this manuscript, as with other projects I do, I'm often trying to figure out, well, if I am going to have this occupation where I do things in this 500-year-old way, what can I make in the world that can only be made by hand? And so like an entirely handmade, hand-lettered, hand-illuminated book, as they did 1,000 years ago, is something that only I could do, and that interests me.
How big are your pages?
Like about a little bit larger than a placemat.
And that has the two sections.
Yeah, it's meant to be a spread.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Because they look bigger.
They do, yeah. We had a museum visit to Duke Farms, and then we went up to the Met, to the Islamic wing, or as they call it, the arts of, but the long name. Anyway, but it was amazing to sort of see some of the book stands and some of the pages that were like so, huge, in that sense.
Or extremely minuscule.
Yeah.
As well.
Now, Zach, do you use techniques that are historically, based, or are you using?
Me?
Yes, Vu. I'm calling you Zach so I can get your name right the next time.
Yes, they're related. I mean, there's a technique that involved to do all these things, which means using a certain kind of paper. Produce paper with a certain surface, which means dyeing it and polishing it.
Do you make your own paper?
Not the base, but I do all the processing of the paper, which takes a long time. And it has to get aged for at least a year before you can use it and stuff like that. The technique is largely the same, but I've had to, change things to fit the location, like they use a starch glues over there, and I found a really good King Arthur's recipe for high gluten flour that works better, So I use airbrushes now and then, I change what I got to change, but I try to keep it in in that technological thing, because it gives me the result I want. I want a certain result, a certain polish, and that's the way to go about it.
So even though you're dealing with calligraphy, you really are approaching it kind of like a painting.
Yeah, everything is a painting.
Mhm.
I have a lot of students, and I teach this stuff from scratch. And they come every 2 weeks, and we have a session, and we work, and we talk, and stuff like that. And I tell them, you're trying to do this letter, for instance, and they can't get it. And I say, look, think of it as a girl, and it's her face, and you're drawing it, and you're drawing it. Just think of it as you're drawing this letter, just like you'd be drawing a person's face, and it has a certain look, and if you don't do it right, it's not going to look like her, So you got to do it so it looks like the example, And so it's the same thing.
Mhm.
It just has a different kind of result, And
What was that laugh about?
well, it's I used to be a comedian, so
Oh, okay.
I always see jokes and stuff. I don't want to get
So
all the things
we
you
can
do.
open it up now if there are any questions from the audience. Yes.
Question, Mr. Burke. When you were putting the painting together, was there a particular translation that you used or interpretation that you followed to help contextualize these paintings?
Yeah. I mean, I don't read Arabic. I read in English translations, and I have 7 or 8 or 12 that I look at often. But as far as most of the texts that I've been directly copying, I've been using the translation by J.M. Rodwell from the 1800s, which is a really poor translation, but it's copyright free. And in the end of my project, I envision it becoming published, and it's legal for me to use it. Unfortunately, it's not the best one. So I often read much better ones which I don't have permission to reproduce without legal problems.
Any other questions? Yes.
So we know that in Islamic art, symmetry is very important, and I can see that definitely in your pieces. And I wonder sometimes, in the past, how difficult it was to make shapes and to make the designs so symmetrical. So today, when you're making your art, your calligraphy, are you using tools or techniques to create that same kind of symmetry? How challenging is it?
Is that
Symmetry.
to me?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was dealing with the whole idea of symmetry.
Yeah.
Which is-
Symmetry is one of those nasty concepts that people think, oh, it isn't Islamic if it isn't symmetry. There's a whole bunch of stereotypes that we have. Like everything's got to be full of blue and full of gold, and it's got to be symmetrical and all these things, and it has to have certain proportions and stuff like that. It simply isn't necessary. The great, I guess, calligraphers starting in the Mamluk time in Egypt, and then the later ones in Istanbul particularly, really broke that thing down. They said, let's use some new colors, let's use some new shapes, let's break the borders, let's do all these things, and that's where it really began to take off. And so I don't base on that, but as a scholarly basis, I study it a lot, and I'm actually writing a book on it now. But these are notions that came up in the 19th century, and they started largely among the Germans, I think, who were the first ones to open up this big scholarly thing on Islamic art. And they pointed out, the symmetry. You got to have little things around the edges, and stuff like that. And so these are just things to be avoided, and changed in any way you can, and make them, develop your own way. That's why when I do something, I take it, let's say, to Dubai, and they say, what's wrong with this piece? I said, nothing's wrong with the piece. Yeah, it's good, but it doesn't look right. I said, because it's not symmetrical. Well, why not? But we're getting the symmetrical effect through non-symmetricality. And we're getting, you know, complexity through non-complexity, and we're getting, you know, all these things. And then suddenly he says, you know, I said, what are you buying it for then? If you don't like the piece, he says, well, you know, I don't understand it, but I think I'll put it away in the drawer, and maybe 100 years from now somebody will figure out what's going on. So that's kind of what happens with it, you know. But people get, you know, really tied up in notions, and it can sink your ship. Unless you're funny, you know, you got a joke.
For those of you guys who've shown in the Middle East and you've shown here, and looking at the panel, being some having stronger ties to the Middle East, less strong ties to the Middle East, this your ethnicity, where you live. Do you feel like your reception when you've shown or done projects in the Middle East versus here, there's a better understanding, or do you think one place gets it more than the rest because those of you who do less traditional work versus more traditional work? And I'm curious, like how, you know, who gets it better?
Shall I? The art world is really different over there. You know, I have a couple of students in Kuwait, and and also some others in Turkey as well as here. And so it's really easy for somebody to have a show for this kind of stuff over there. It's no big deal, you know. The galleries jump at the chance to show stuff, and when they do, you know, the Minister of Culture comes on and slices the ribbon, you know, and all that stuff, and it's a big deal. They get media coverage. Media coverage is horrible. They get everything wrong, but at least they get media coverage. Here, to get a show is like a 1 in 10 year event. You know, it doesn't happen fast. It doesn't happen easy. And when they do, nobody comes, and the media don't ignore it. You know, so it's far preferable to us who are doing this. Really, is to get shows over there. At least we can make a living on it. But you know, all these funny questions do come up. You know, like what are you doing it for, and all that kind of stuff. But by and large, it's not so bad.
Well, I can't really say like who gets it more. I think each viewer, you know, I think viewers from, you know, the United States have a lot of different interpretations on it. Same when I show in Dubai, a lot of different, and sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they don't. But I would say like, you know, like when I've shown in Dubai, like I've heard my work described as kitschy multiple times, which I would take as an insult, but it's meant in like, you know, because for there, it's like an aesthetic that is so maybe ingrained or commonplace that it is kitschy. Where I think here maybe it doesn't have that like kind of, I guess, baggage tied to it. But in terms of like how people receive the work, I think the difference from what I've seen is not too much. There's, you know, a lot of times I think overlapping interpretations for sure.
Afruz, can you tell us, first of all, it's all handmade,
There are
right?
2 docents, so.
It's all handmade, you don't use any stencils?
Oh, of course I do.
You do use stencils?
Yeah. I draw the drawing, right? And I scan drawings into, you know, the computer, and I put the drawings together, and then I print them out.
Okay.
Because I used to draw directly onto the material, and then the graphite would get absorbed by the material, and I wouldn't be able to get it out. So I just scan it, you know.
And then the other question I have is, can you just tell us a little bit more about the symbolism in art acts?
So, you know, I'm just going to say the truth because I had a very personal drama with this piece, love, this kind of thing. And so I kind of dressed it up in Sufi, Sufi symbolism to kind of, so that I could talk about it publicly, so it wouldn't be like a total embarrassment. And here I am talking about it publicly. But some of the symbolism, no, it is about like the process of, truly it is about the process of attaining or the differences between a sort of earthly love and a spiritual love. Certainly there's symbolism in there which draws upon notions we associate with peacocks, which I think traditionally are, the peacock represents pride, the peacock represents vanity, and I have extended those meanings to what I think their logical conclusions are, which are oftentimes aggression, nationalism, and war. So to me, the peacock represents all those things. And some of the imagery that I use has these peacock feathers that are daggers, that have daggers at the end of their plumes, and the daggers are sort of on their way plunging into a human heart. So that can be interpreted in many different ways. Part of it is, the destruction of the ego as being necessary towards the ultimate journey towards love. So that's just
Yes, I have a question. I was struck, Afruz, when you were speaking about how issues of identity never come up when you're talking with your colleagues and fellow artists. They only come up in an institutional setting. I wondered if that was true for the other artists. It's a two-part question. I wondered if it was true for the other artists. And then I wondered, when you are talking to your friends and your colleagues and your fellow artists, what you talk about.
Sports, usually. I would say it definitely comes up more in institutional settings. I don't know if it never comes up with my friends or other artists. I would say it does. But I would say the time that I heard it the most was when I was in grad school. It was like incessant. Every professor, every other student, kind of like the school I went to was very abstract painting heavy, trying to get me to make abstract paintings and don't get into this whole identity politics thing. It's gonna ruin you, and that thing is dead. So it was kind of like this thing of choose a side sort of thing when I was in school, and that was, I would say, by far the time that I heard it the most. Since I've been out of school, I don't hear it much. Even when I have visits with, be it like a gallerist or somebody from a museum or a writer, it doesn't come up that often, and it doesn't come up that often with friends either. So I would say more in an institutional setting, but mainly in school.
It's a terrible question. In my case, people always say, well, where are you from? And I say, I'm from LA. Because they're looking for something else. You see, there's a whole white man, and they want to say, what exotic place do you come from, and say, well, where's your parents from? I said, well, they're from LA. And they said, well, where'd they come from? And I said, well, how about them Redskins? It's one of those things that it can be annoying unless you kind of like to play with people. I kind of like to play with people a little bit.
I agree. It only comes up in institutions. When I'm working on my own, I just never interest in it. I don't think about it at all. I don't worry about it at all.
Do you think it's because institutions have to slide in? I mean, I was struck when I first, when the Islamic or the Arts of the Arab Lands, Turkey, right, at the Met opened up because, I worked there for 27 years, so it was interesting to see. And then I walked into the Kevorkian Gallery, and there were all these contemporary artists, half of which I had brought into the collection when I was at the Met. And I was sitting there going, I wonder if they've shown these in the contemporary art, galleries. It was just, this type of thing. So, is it because museums have different departments and you have to slot somewhere? I mean, in talking to my colleagues at the Met now, it's very interesting because every department is getting in on the contemporary end, whether it's Asian art or African art, because that's where the growth is. But then it gets absurd because Arts of Asia, Africa, and Oceania bought an L on Itsui at the same time, and they didn't know that the modern art department had bought an L on Itsui. So now the Met has two L on Itsuis, you know. So, so it must be something about, you know, like how we, you know, I think here at Met we don't compartmentalize because we don't have compartments, but maybe in other institutions, because, you know, particularly encyclopedic ones, they do. Is it different, like, say, at the Met than, say, if you did it at a really contemporary place like the New Museum or something like that?
I think that probably does have a lot to do with it. I'll just, a museum that'll remain nameless and a curator that'll remain nameless. Somebody tried to get me in contact with this person because they were putting together the collection of modern Islamic art for the museum. And I met her, and she said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm mostly painting." "Oh, I'm not buying paintings." And she was like, "What kind of colors do you use?" I was like, "All of them? I don't know." And she's like, "Well, I'm not buying stuff with color unless it fits into the like traditional Islamic palette. And I'm mostly only buying photography." So then somebody made a joke like, "Oh, you should take a black and white picture of one of your paintings and sell it to her." But, you know, it's that kind of thing, like such a narrow focus of what's acceptable and what's not. I won't say. I won't say.
I'll tell you later.
I wanna make amend. I want to amend something I said earlier about talking about identity. It does come up, but the way it comes up is like me and my other artist friends, female friends, on a daily basis are talking about, "Oh, yeah, I went to Home Depot today. You know that some guy asked me if I knew what a sawhorse was, you know, or, oh, I went to the welder today and he just gave me such an attitude." Being a female artist comes up non-stop as an issue.
Any other questions? Is there any last statement you want to say or some point you want to make that we haven't covered?
No. But I'm really glad to be here. This has been really interesting. I'm really happy to be involved.
Great. Well, thank you for coming. Join me in thanking our fabulous panelists.